The passengers were settling into their seats, the hum of the engines filling the cabin as the flight attendants moved through the aisles. Among them was a man sitting quietly in first class, dressed simply, minding his own business. But for one particular stewardess, he didn't look like he belonged there. Her sharp gaze lingered on him, suspicion creeping into her expression. She approached with a forced smile, her tone cold. "Are you sure you're in the right seat?" The man barely reacted, simply nodding. Annoyed, she turned back toward the galley, muttering under her breath. Moments later, she returned, carrying a cup of steaming hot water. What happened next would leave the entire cabin in shock. With one swift motion, she accidentally spilled the scalding water on his face. Gasps filled the air. But what she didn't know, the man she had just humiliated, he owned the very plane she worked on. The cabin fell silent as the man flinched, his skin stinging from the burning liquid. A few passengers gasped, while others whispered in disbelief. The stewardess barely looked apologetic. Instead, she crossed her arms, waiting for a reaction, as if expecting him to lash out. But he didn't. He simply reached for a napkin, dabbing his face, his expression unreadable. "Sir, if you're going to cause a problem, I'll have to ask you to leave," she said, her voice laced with authority. Some passengers exchanged uneasy glances. A businessman in a nearby seat frowned, sensing something wasn't right. The man took a deep breath, still calm. "And how exactly do you plan to remove me?" His voice was even, but there was something in his tone that made the stewardess pause. Before she could answer, another flight attendant hurried over, her face pale. She leaned in and whispered something in her colleague's ear, words that made the stewardess' face drain of color. The stewardess stiffened, her fingers tightening around the tray she still held. Whatever her colleague had whispered had shaken her. She forced a nervous smile, but her confidence wavered. The man leaned back in his seat, watching her with quiet patience. He didn't have to say anything, he was waiting. The tension in the cabin thickened as passengers pretended not to stare, but their curiosity was undeniable. I need to check something," the stewardess mumbled, turning abruptly. She walked toward the front of the plane, her steps quick and unsteady. The second flight attendant lingered for a moment, her expression apologetic. "Sir, are you all right?" she asked softly. He nodded, still calm. "I'll be fine," he said, but there was something in his eyes, something unreadable yet powerful. Meanwhile, in the flight deck, the lead steward was already pulling up the passenger manifest. His eyes widened as he read the name. That man? The owner. His breath caught. They had made a huge mistake. The stewardess stood near the flight deck, her hands trembling as she watched the lead steward's reaction. "What's wrong?" she whispered, her throat dry. He slowly looked up, his face pale. "That man, he owns this plane. He owns the entire airline." His voice was barely above a breath, but the words hit her like a punch to the stomach. Back in the cabin, the tension only grew. The man remained composed, but there was an unmistakable shift in the energy around him. The passengers sensed it, the way the crew suddenly moved differently, the way whispers spread like wildfire. The stewardess hesitated before stepping back toward first class. Her mind raced, trying to find a way to fix what she had done. She had judged him, humiliated him, and now reality was crushing down on her. She stopped a few feet away, her voice hesitant. "Sir, I didn't know." The man slowly turned to look at her. The entire cabin held its breath. The man met her gaze, his expression unreadable. The silence between them stretched, heavy with tension. The stewardess shifted uncomfortably, searching for the right words, but before she could speak again, a new voice cut through the air. "Excuse me, is there a problem here?" A well-dressed older man had stepped forward from a few rows behind. His sharp eyes flickered between the stewardess and the seated man. There was something familiar about him, something authoritative. The stewardess recognized him instantly. He was a high-ranking executive in the airline, someone who rarely flew commercial but had immense power behind the scenes. The realization made her stomach twist. If he was here, then he had witnessed everything. The executive didn't wait for a response. He turned to the man in the seat and extended a hand. "I sincerely apologize for any mistreatment, sir. This is unacceptable." Passengers whispered among themselves, sensing the shift. But the man in the seat still didn't move. Instead, he exhaled slowly, then spoke. "I appreciate that," he said evenly. "But what I really want to know is, how often does this happen?" The stewardess froze. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about something much bigger. And she wasn't sure if there was any way to undo what had already been set in motion. The cabin was silent. The weight of the man's words hung in the air, pressing down on everyone. The stewardess swallowed hard, her face pale. She had thought this was just one bad interaction, a mistake she could apologize for and move past. But now she realized this was bigger than her. The executive hesitated before answering. "We take incidents like this very seriously," he said carefully. "I assure you there will be consequences." The man finally stood up, his calm presence commanding attention. Consequences. He let the word hang for a moment before shaking his head. "I don't need apologies. I need change." His voice was steady, but there was an unmistakable authority behind it. Passengers watched in awe as he turned to the stewardess. "Tell me, would you have treated me differently if you knew who I was?" Her lips parted, but no words came out, because deep down she knew the truth. Then, just as the tension reached its peak, another voice spoke up from the back of the cabin. "This isn't the first time something like this has happened," a woman said firmly. Heads turned. A flight attendant from economy class had stepped forward, her expression tense but determined. The executive's face tightened. The stewardess's breath hitched. And in that moment, it became clear. This wasn't just about one incident. This was about a system that had been ignored for too long. The man looked around the cabin, nodding slightly. "That's what I thought." He reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out a sleek business card, and handed it to the executive. "We'll be having a conversation soon," he said. Then, with quiet confidence, he sat back down. The stewardess stood frozen, realizing this flight, and her career, would never be the same again. The stewardess lowered her gaze, realizing there was nothing she could say to undo what had happened. The plane was still mid-flight, but the atmosphere had completely shifted. Passengers exchanged knowing glances, some nodding in quiet approval, others simply absorbing the moment. The executive clutched the business card, his mind racing. He knew this conversation wouldn't end when they landed. Changes would have to be made, real ones. As for the man, he remained composed, sipping his water as if nothing had happened. But everyone knew something had. A message had been sent, loud and clear. When the plane finally touched down, the crew avoided his gaze, while the flight attendant who had spoken up gave him a small, grateful nod. He returned it, standing up to leave. Before stepping off, he glanced back once. Not out of anger, just as a quiet reminder. Some lessons, after all, are never forgotten.